Orenthal James Simpson, known to the world simply as OJ, was more than just a famous football player. He was an American icon. His journey from the housing projects of San Francisco to becoming a Heisman Trophy winner and a record-breaking NFL running back was a story of triumph. After his football career, he seamlessly transitioned into a beloved public figure, charming audiences as an actor in movies like The Naked Gun, and as a friendly face in Hertz rental car commercials. He was charismatic, handsome, and widely admired, representing a version of the American dream that seemed to transcend racial lines. By the early 1990s, Simpson had cultivated an image of a successful, affable celebrity who was welcomed into every part of society. This carefully constructed public persona made the events of June 1994 all the more shocking and honestly incomprehensible to millions of people. The news that O.J. Simpson was a suspect in the brutal murders of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend Ron Goldman, was a seismic event in American culture. It was a story that contained all the elements of a Greek tragedy, a fallen hero, love, jealousy, and extreme violence. The subsequent trial became a national obsession, not just because of Simpson's fame, but because it forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about race, celebrity, domestic violence, and the very nature of its justice system. The case was a cultural flashpoint that captivated the world. The importance of the O.J. Simpson trial cannot be overstated. It was one of the first major news events to be covered by 24-hour cable news networks, turning the courtroom proceedings into a daily soap opera for the entire nation. Every twist and turn was broadcast live, and every piece of evidence was debated not just by legal experts on television, but by ordinary people in their homes and workplaces. The trial became a deeply polarizing event, often splitting public opinion along racial lines. For many, it was a straightforward murder case, while for others, it became a referendum on the Los Angeles Police Department and its history of racial bias, especially in the wake of the Rodney King riots. The saga laid bare the deep divisions within American society. The question of Simpson's guilt or innocence became intertwined with broader issues of systemic injustice and the power of celebrity. The trial wasn't just about one man, it was about how the legal system functions, who it protects, and who it fails. The spectacle of the white Ford Bronco chase, the high-powered dream team of defense lawyers, and the dramatic courtroom moments created a media frenzy that has rarely been matched since. The story of O.J. Simpson is the story of how a beloved hero's spectacular fall from grace put the American justice system itself on trial before the entire world. The night of Sunday, June 12, 1994, was a warm evening in the affluent Los Angeles neighborhood of Brentwood. Inside her condominium on Bundy Drive, Nicole Brown Simpson had put her two young children to bed after having dinner with her family at a nearby restaurant, Mezzaluna. Earlier that evening, her mother had accidentally left her glasses at the restaurant. A young waiter and aspiring model named Ron Goldman, who was a friend of Nicole's, offered to drop them off at her home on his way to meet friends. It was a simple act of kindness, a small detour that would tragically place him at the scene of a horrific crime. He arrived at Nicole's condominium shortly after 10:00 p.m., never to be seen alive again. Around midnight, a neighbor discovered a disturbing scene. Nicole's Akita dog was barking restlessly, its paws stained with blood. The neighbor, following the distressed animal, was led to the walkway in front of Nicole's home. There, he found a gruesome sight. The lifeless bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman lay in a pool of blood. The attack had been incredibly violent and swift. Nicole had been stabbed multiple times, with a final, deep slash across her neck that nearly decapitated her. Ron Goldman had also been stabbed repeatedly, and it was clear he had put up a fierce struggle against his attacker. The brutality of the murders sent a wave of shock through the quiet, wealthy community. The Los Angeles Police Department was immediately called to the scene, and the investigation began. Detectives quickly noted a trail of bloody footprints leading away from the bodies, left by a single perpetrator wearing expensive Bruno Magli shoes. They also found a bloody leather glove near the victims. Based on the history of domestic violence between O.J. Simpson and his ex-wife, investigators' suspicion almost immediately turned toward the former football star. They went to his estate on Rockingham Avenue, just a couple of miles away, to inform him of his ex-wife's death. It was there, on his property, that the case against him began to solidify in the minds of the police. At the Rockingham estate, Detective Mark Fuhrman made a crucial discovery. he found a second bloody leather glove behind a guest house on the property, one that appeared to be a match to the one found at the murder scene. This seemed to be a powerful piece of evidence directly linking Simpson to the crime. Police also found blood drops in the driveway and inside Simpson's white Ford Bronco, which was parked outside. With this mounting evidence, the focus of the investigation narrowed intensely. The man who had once been a celebrated American hero was now the prime suspect in a brutal double homicide, setting the stage for one of the most polarizing legal battles in modern history. Following the discovery of the evidence at his home, O.J. Simpson was asked to turn himself in to the police. What happened next, on June 17, 1994, became one of the most surreal and memorable events in television history. Instead of surrendering, Simpson became a fugitive. He was spotted on a Southern California freeway in a white Ford Bronco, driven by his loyal friend and former teammate, Al Cowlings. With Simpson reportedly in the back holding a gun to his own head, a bizarre, low-speed chase ensued. News helicopters broadcast the chase live to an estimated 95 million viewers, who watched for hours as police cars followed the Bronco. The chase finally ended back at Simpson's Rockingham estate, where he surrendered to police. The criminal trial, officially titled The People of the State of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, began in January 1995 and was presided over by Judge Lance Ito. The prosecution was led by Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden. Their team believed they had a mountain of evidence that would surely lead to a conviction. They planned to present a compelling narrative that Simpson, driven by jealousy and rage over his ex-wife moving on with her life, had committed the murders. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of physical evidence, including DNA from blood found at the crime scene and at Simpson's home, the matching bloody gloves, and the trail of bloody shoe prints. On the other side was Simpson's legal dream team, a group of high-profile and highly skilled defense attorneys. The team was led by the charismatic Johnny Cochran and the strategic Robert Shapiro, and included renowned lawyers like F. Lee Bailey, Alan Dershowitz, and DNA expert Barry Scheck. Their strategy was not necessarily to prove Simpson was innocent, but to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. They planned to attack the credibility of the prosecution's evidence by arguing that the crime scene had been contaminated, that evidence had been mishandled, and most explosively, that key pieces of evidence had been planted by racist police officers who were determined to frame a famous black man. After 11 months of testimony, legal arguments, and intense media scrutiny, the case finally went to the jury. The world watched and waited. On October 3, 1995, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury delivered its verdict. In a moment that stunned many and was celebrated by others, the jury foreman announced that O.J. Simpson was not guilty on both counts of murder. The courtroom erupted. Simpson mouthed, "Thank you" to the jury, while Ron Goldman's family sobbed openly. The verdict, broadcast live across the nation, instantly became a defining moment, exposing the deep racial chasm in America's perception of justice, policing, and the legal system itself. The prosecution, led by Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, was confident in its case against O.J. Simpson. They believed they had an overwhelming amount of physical evidence that would create a direct and undeniable link between Simpson and the murders. The centerpiece of their case was the DNA evidence. Blood found at the crime scene on Bundy Drive contained DNA that matched Simpson's. A drop of blood found near the bodies had a genetic profile consistent with his, suggesting that the killer had cut himself during the violent struggle. Furthermore, blood found inside Simpson's Ford Bronco and on a pair of socks discovered in his bedroom contained a mixture of DNA from Simpson, Nicole Brown Simpson, and Ron Goldman. In addition to the DNA, the prosecution presented other powerful physical evidence. A trail of bloody footprints was found leading away from the bodies. The prints were made by a size 12 Bruno Magli shoe, a rare and expensive Italian brand. The prosecution presented a photograph of Simpson wearing the exact same style of shoe at a football game months before the murders, directly contradicting his claim that he would never own such ugly-ass shoes. Then there were the leather gloves. One bloody glove was found at the crime scene, and its apparent match was discovered by Detective Mark Fuhrman on Simpson's property. The prosecution argued that Simpson dropped one glove at the scene and inadvertently carried the other back to his estate. The prosecution also sought to establish a motive for the murders by detailing a long and disturbing history of domestic violence. They presented evidence, including Nicole's diary entries and frantic 911 calls, to portray Simpson not as a charming celebrity, but as a jealous, controlling, and violent man who could not stand to see his ex-wife move on with her life. Friends and family testified about incidents where Simpson had stalked, threatened, and physically abused Nicole. The prosecution argued that the murders were the final, tragic culmination of this pattern of abuse. They wanted the jury to see that the man who had committed these brutal acts was the same man who had terrorized his wife for years. Finally, the prosecution attempted to dismantle Simpson's alibi for the night of the murders. Simpson claimed he was at home, waiting for a limousine to take him to the airport for a flight to Chicago. However, the limo driver, Alan Park, testified that he arrived at Simpson's estate at the scheduled time, but could not get an answer at the gate for nearly an hour. Just before Simpson finally appeared, Park saw a shadowy figure resembling Simpson walk up the driveway and enter the house. This testimony suggested that Simpson was not at home when he claimed to be, giving him a window of opportunity to commit the murders and return before his flight. The prosecution wove these elements together to paint a picture of a guilty man. The defense team, led by the brilliant and theatrical Johnny Cochran, understood that they could not simply refute the prosecution's mountain of evidence piece by piece. Instead, they adopted a bold and effective strategy to attack the integrity of the evidence itself and the people who collected it. Their central argument was that the police investigation was so sloppy, contaminated, and corrupted by racism that none of the evidence could be trusted. They argued that from the very beginning the Los Angeles Police Department was incompetent at best, and at worst engaged in a conspiracy to frame a famous African-American man. This narrative was designed to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. A key part of this strategy involved challenging the handling of the physical evidence. The defense's DNA experts, Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, relentlessly cross-examined the prosecution's criminalists. They pointed out numerous procedural errors, such as how blood samples were collected, stored, and transported. They suggested that evidence could have been cross-contaminated in the lab, meaning that blood from one sample might have accidentally been mixed with another. They highlighted that a police criminalist had carried a vial of Simpson's blood in his pocket for several hours, creating an opportunity for it to be planted at the crime scene, or on other pieces of evidence like the socks found in Simpson's bedroom. The most dramatic moment of the trial, and the one that, perfectly encapsulated the defense's strategy, came when prosecutor Christopher Darden asked Simpson to try on the infamous bloody gloves. In a piece of courtroom theater orchestrated by the defense, Simpson struggled to pull the leather gloves over his hands, which were covered by latex gloves for protection. They appeared to be too small. As Simpson grunted and showed the jury how the gloves did not fit, Johnny Cochran stood by, knowing he had been handed a powerful visual. This moment allowed Cochran to coin the most memorable phrase of the trial in his closing arguments: "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." This slogan became the rallying cry for the defense. It was a simple, powerful, and easy-to-remember concept that summarized their entire case. The ill-fitting glove became a potent symbol for everything the defense claimed was wrong with the prosecution's case. It suggested that the evidence had been manipulated, or was simply incorrect. By focusing on the glove, the defense managed to shift the jury's attention away from the damning DNA evidence, and toward a tangible, visible piece of evidence that seemed to support their theory of a frame-up. The glove demonstration was a masterful piece of legal strategy that played a significant role in creating the reasonable doubt needed for an acquittal. The O.J. Simpson trial did not happen in a vacuum. It took place in Los Angeles just a few years after the 1992 riots, which erupted after 4 LAPD officers were acquitted in the brutal beating of a black motorist named Rodney King. This event had laid bare the deep-seated anger and distrust that many in the African-American community felt toward the police. The defense team, particularly Johnny Cochran, skillfully tapped into this atmosphere of racial tension. They framed the trial not just as a murder case, but as a battle against a racist and corrupt police department that had a long history of targeting and framing black men. This narrative resonated strongly with the jury, which was composed mostly of African Americans. The defense's focus on race came to a head with one key figure, Detective Mark Fuhrman. Fuhrman was the detective who claimed to have found the bloody glove on Simpson's property, a crucial piece of evidence linking Simpson to the crime. During his initial testimony, Fuhrman was asked by defense attorney F. Lee Bailey if he had used the N-word in the past 10 years. Fuhrman, under oath, denied it. This denial would become a turning point in the trial. The defense had been searching for evidence to discredit Fuhrman and prove he was a racist, and now they had him locked into a lie. They argued that a racist cop like Fuhrman would have both the motive and the opportunity to plant the glove to frame a black celebrity. The bombshell came when the defense produced a series of audio tapes. These tapes were recordings of interviews Fuhrman had given to a screenwriter named Laura McKinney for a project about the police. On these tapes, Fuhrman was heard repeatedly using the N-word and other racial slurs. He also bragged about manufacturing evidence, beating suspects, and lying to internal affairs. The tapes were devastating to the prosecution's case. They not only proved that Fuhrman had committed perjury on the witness stand, but they also seemed to confirm the defense's darkest portrayal of him as a rogue, racist cop who was capable of planting evidence. The tapes made him the embodiment of everything the defense said was wrong with the LAPD. When Fuhrman was called back to the stand to be questioned about the tapes, he refused to answer any questions, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. This act was seen by many as a tacit admission of guilt. Johnny Cochran, in his closing argument, compared Fuhrman to Adolf Hitler and called him a genocidal racist and a lying, perjuring, racist cop. By successfully painting Fuhrman as a symbol of police corruption, the defense gave the jury a powerful reason to doubt all the evidence he had touched. The Fuhrman tapes shifted the focus of the trial from O.J. Simpson to the LAPD, making it possible for the jury to believe that reasonable doubt existed. While O.J. Simpson was a free man after his acquittal in the criminal trial, his legal battles were far from over. The families of the victims, the Browns and the Goldmans, were determined to seek justice in a different venue. In 1996, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Simpson in civil court. This new trial was fundamentally different from the criminal one. The standard of proof was much lower. Instead of needing to prove Simpson's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the plaintiffs only had to show by a preponderance of the evidence that it was more likely than not that Simpson was responsible for the deaths. This is a much easier legal hurdle to clear. The civil trial also had a different jury and took place in a different location. It was held in Santa Monica, a predominantly white and affluent area, and the jury reflected this demographic shift. Unlike the criminal trial jury, this one was mostly white. Furthermore, the rules of the civil trial were different. The judge allowed evidence that had been excluded from the criminal trial, such as the photo of Simpson wearing the Bruno Magli shoes. Most importantly, O.J. Simpson, who had not testified in his own defense during the criminal trial, was forced to take the stand and answer questions under oath. His testimony, in which he denied the murders but often appeared evasive and angry, did not help his case. The defense's strategy of blaming a racist police department was far less effective in this new setting. The jury in Santa Monica was less receptive to the argument of a police frame-up, and the focus remained squarely on the evidence against Simpson. The plaintiff's lawyer, Daniel Petrocelli, relentlessly questioned Simpson about his history of domestic abuse and the inconsistencies in his story. After months of testimony, the civil jury reached a verdict in February 1997. They found O.J. Simpson liable for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. The jury ordered him to pay $8.5 million in compensatory damages to the Goldman family and an additional $25 million in punitive damages to both families. Despite this legal victory, the families received little in the way of financial justice. Simpson claimed he was broke and took steps to protect his assets from being seized. He moved to Florida, a state with a homestead exception law that protected his home from being taken to pay off the judgment. Much of his income came from his NFL pension, which was also shielded from creditors by federal law. Over the years, the amount he owed grew to over $100 million with interest, but he paid only a tiny fraction of it. The civil verdict provided a moral victory for the families, but it also highlighted a failure of the justice system to provide meaningful restitution, leaving the families with a hollow sense of justice. After being acquitted of murder, O.J. Simpson's life was far from the triumphant return to glory he might have imagined. Although he was legally a free man, he became a pariah in many circles. He lost his lucrative endorsement deals, was expelled from exclusive country clubs, and was largely shunned by the celebrity world that had once embraced him. He attempted to cash in on his notoriety with projects like the controversial book, a hypothetical account of how he would have committed the murders, which sparked a massive public outcry and was eventually pulled from publication. His reputation was permanently tarnished, and he was followed by a cloud of suspicion and public disdain. Simpson continued to have run-ins with the law. In 2001, he was acquitted of charges in a road rage incident in Florida. However, his luck ran out in 2007. Simpson led a group of men into a Las Vegas hotel room to confront two sports memorabilia dealers. He claimed the dealers had stolen personal items from him, including his Hall of Fame certificate and family photos. The confrontation, however, involved at least one man carrying a gun. Unfortunately for Simpson, one of his accomplices secretly recorded the entire incident, capturing Simpson yelling at the men and directing his associates to take the items. The audio recordings were damning evidence. This time, the justice system came down hard on him. On October 3, 2008, exactly 13 years to the day after his murder acquittal, a Las Vegas jury found O.J. Simpson guilty of numerous felonies, including armed robbery and kidnapping. The judge sentenced him to a term of 9 to 33 years in a Nevada state prison. Many observers felt the lengthy sentence was not just for the robbery, but was also a form of retroactive punishment for the murders he was acquitted of years earlier. The man who had famously escaped a life sentence for a double murder was now imprisoned for a clumsy and ill-conceived hotel room heist. Simpson served 9 years in prison before being granted parole. He was released on October 1, 2017 and lived a relatively quiet life in Las Vegas, often seen playing golf and interacting with the public. His later conviction and imprisonment profoundly changed the public's perception of him. For those who had always believed he was guilty of the murders, his conviction for robbery felt like a long overdue form of cosmic justice. It solidified his image as a criminal, not a wronged victim of the system. O.J. Simpson died from cancer on April 10, 2024, leaving behind a legacy forever defined by crime, controversy, and the unresolved question of his guilt. When we look back on the O.J. Simpson saga, the central question remains, did the justice system work? The answer is complicated and depends entirely on one's perspective. For many, particularly in white America, the criminal trial was an abject failure. They saw a man who was clearly guilty, based on a mountain of DNA and circumstantial evidence, walk free because of his wealth, his fame, and a cynical defense strategy that played the race card. From this viewpoint, a charismatic lawyer and a sympathetic jury allowed a brutal killer to escape punishment. The not guilty verdict felt like a stunning miscarriage of justice, a moment when the system failed the victims, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, and their grieving families. Conversely, for a significant portion of the African American community, the verdict was seen in a very different light. It was not necessarily a declaration of Simpson's innocence, but rather a powerful rebuke of a corrupt and racist police department. In the context of the Rodney King beating and a long history of police misconduct, the acquittal felt like a form of payback, a moment when the system, which so often failed black defendants, was finally held accountable for its flaws. From this perspective, the defense's ability to expose Mark Fuhrman's perjury and racism created a legitimate reasonable doubt, and the jury was correct to acquit based on the principle that flawed evidence cannot lead to a conviction. The civil trial adds another layer of complexity to the legacy. In that courtroom, a different jury looked at much of the same evidence and came to the opposite conclusion, finding Simpson responsible for the deaths. This provided a measure of moral validation for the victims' families, but it was an incomplete form of justice. The fact that Simpson largely avoided paying the massive financial damages showed a failure in the civil system's ability to enforce its own judgments and provide restitution. This outcome left the families with a legal victory that felt hollow, as the person found responsible for their loss continued to live a comfortable life, shielded by legal loopholes. Ultimately, the O.J. Simpson case may be an example of the justice system both working and failing simultaneously. It worked in the sense that a defendant is presumed innocent and the burden is on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense successfully created that doubt, however it failed in its larger mission to deliver a result that society could perceive as just and credible. The case exposed deep racial divides, highlighted the influence of wealth and celebrity in the courtroom, and eroded public trust in the legal process. It left behind a legacy of unanswered questions and two families who never received the justice they so desperately sought, reminding us that a legal verdict is not always the same as the truth.